I get the pleasure of introducing Dusty Rhoads, and I'm sure that you're all here because you read that little description of his research and of his bio, and that's why you've all signed up. So I don't really have to say much, but there's a few things that struck me when I read that same information. Um, Dusty earned a Master of Science really recently, doing the research that appears is what he's going to talk about tonight. So when I read the description, it was studying Texas horned lizards in small Texas towns. And since that's the place I grew up with, Texas horned lizards, that kind of struck a chord. The other thing that I can say about Dusty is he has been participating in the NPAT activities over the last 2 Saturdays. He joined us both for the Prairie Seekers Workshop, and then this past weekend he was at the Landowners. And I think he's a rather quiet and studious person. So I'm looking forward to having a chance that we get to learn from him now about the Texas horned lizard. So Dusty, if you'd like to take the reins and tell us about your research, we're all eager to learn.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate and Michelle. All right, so first, I guess we can, I can open this to people turn their mics on because I have a question I just want to ask. Does anybody know who painted this painting here on the first slide?
I don't.
Audubon?
Yes, yes, it was, someone said Audubon. It was John James Audubon. He painted this from Texas, a visit to Texas in the 1830s. I'll come back to this slide later, but it has a Texas horned lizard in it down the bottom left there. So this talk is based on part of a book, the first few chapters of a book that I've been working on the last year and a half for TCU Press, which I started only a few months after finishing my master's program studying camouflage in Texas horned lizards at TCU. It came about because of an idea in a book I had read when I was finishing my undergrad degree about 12 years ago. The book was by Douglas Tallamy, and it was called Bringing Nature Home, How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. And Douglas's book was groundbreaking, and the popularity of it spread like Johnson grass. And it won all sorts of awards because it helped the average homeowner realize something powerful, that planting native plants in your yard is one of the last ways we have to restore wildlife on this planet that we've nearly completely gridded up with housing developments, streets, farms, factories, and shopping centers. Doug's thesis in his book is very alluring. Basically, it's this: if you plant species X in your yard, then species Y will come and visit it. And this was brilliant, I thought. There should be a specific formula for every reptile species. For several reasons, including so much public interest and work being done by zoos and state wildlife agencies and universities, I thought finding a Texas horned lizard formula for homeowners and landowners would be a great project. The solution was deceptively simple at first blush. Simply find out what species to plant to support harvester ants, the favorite foods of horned lizards. Of course, I knew that horned lizards ate other insect species, including other ants, and I knew that harvester ants ate things besides seeds. But first things first, I thought it would be a great starting point. Still, I was maybe more than a little naive on my part. When I contacted a harvester ant researcher who Suzanne Tuttle from NPAT put me in touch with, her response was sobering. First, I would say that this is the wrong kind of question, she said. She goes, what is needed is a fuller ecological view. I suggest planting what is typical of the area is the best option when considering the ants, although they may forage seeds from agricultural or horticultural plants just as well. The ecosystem is more than the ants and more than the lizard-ant connection. And she went on to tell me that there are other aspects of the environment more important than the mere presence of the seeds for the harvester ants. Things like the soil, the quality of the soil. At first, I thought that I confirmed that stupid questions do in fact exist based on her answer. But that sting soon subsided, and I was grateful for her gentle but firm course correction. because it started me on a path of discovery I had no idea that I would embark on. It made me realize that I needed to learn the history of the environment that gave birth to Texas horned lizards. So I soon found myself reading books on things like bison and grasslands and prairies in general, and ants, quails, prairie dogs, pronghorn, coyotes, prairie fires, plains Indians, and many others in order to understand what Richard Manning might have meant in his book Grassland when he said, all life is tied to the land that made it. What I'm going to try to convince you of in this talk is that Texas horned lizards are a prairie species, a community species, a species that depends on communities of other organisms and inputs, creatures and plants that share the load to create a beautiful life of diversity. And another goal I have for you is that when people later on ask you, what happened to the horny toad? Was it the fire ants? Was it pesticides? Was it development? You can say, well, we got rid of the prairie, and they're a prairie species. They depend on it. But I believe we can restore it. And I will say I started writing this book for the everyday Texan, not necessarily for prairie experts like many of yourselves, but people kind of more like myself who did not understand the vital and crucial link between horned lizards and the land that made them. But I think because the word habitat is species specific, we can explore the history of Mother Prairie and pay focused attention to the particular gifts she gave horned lizards to benefit from and inhabit her lands. I will say the first 15 or so slides are historical in nature, but I promise it will all tie in with horned lizards. Okay, so if you could go back in time a couple hundred years, stretch your arms wide and harness all the power and majesty of the Great Plains as it existed then, and compress it into a size small enough to hold in your hand and fit into your pocket, it just might be a horny toad. It is perhaps no coincidence then that in a less figurative sense, that is precisely what a lot of older generations did. Many a horned lizard was an unwitting but undeservedly congenial pocket companion of many a backyard explorer. Horned lizards are a rare exception of accessibility. Most of the macro-sized animal life and other natural forces one would witness upon a brief sweeping gaze at that early American savanna were not as approachable. Whether they had formidable size, horns that could gore, faster than human speed, or wings for flying off. Small wonder that humans have taken a liking to horny toads. And consider that environment 200 years ago. What a savanna it was. In fact, it was safari. When the first Euro-American explorers and settlers clapped eyes on the Great Plains, they must have been utterly gobsmacked at what they saw. Scores of bison, with impressive bands of wolves hot on their heels, and some 50,000 to 100,000 grizzly bears dotted the expanse of the plains in their wake, scavenging the scraps, with elk and pronghorn antelope filling in the gaps. It must have been an impressive sight. Certainly there was grandeur. Meriwether Lewis was obliged to write in his journal in 1804, this scenery, already rich, pleasing, and beautiful, was still further heightened by immense herds of buffalo, deer, elk, and antelopes, which we saw in every direction, feeding on the hills and plains. I do not think I exaggerate when I estimate the number of buffalo which could be comprehended at one view to amount to 3,000, close quote. Still, it was not all home on the range for everyone, nor was it without its share of discouraging word. For early settlers and homesteaders, the sheer wildness of the central grasslands must have also been somewhat intimidating, if not more than a gentle rebuke to the agrarian who saw his mission to make the desert bloom as divinely anointed. "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie" was not just a folk song, it was a bone-deep settler's lament, and underscored certain overwhelm for many homesteaders who too often succumbed to suicide from this prairie madness, the type of depression they suffered from. Settlers grasped at whatever inviting thing they could to make themselves feel more at ease and in control. Indeed, horned lizards, like toy dinosaurs as they are often described, seem to encapture in a tiny, manageable body all of the features that the less approachable megafauna of the early American Serengeti possessed, without any of the peril. French trappers on the plains in the 1700s and early 1800s called horned lizards prairie buffalo, perhaps due to their cranial horns and preferred haunts. But some of those less approachable forces of the former prairie, the bison herds moving through, wallowing and grazing as they went, creating bare ground here and subsequent new grass growth there. The wildfires sparked by lightning and clearing heavy brush, allowing sunlight to penetrate the soil, also encouraging new plant generations. And the winds, birds, and even rattlesnakes that carried seeds within them, perpetuating prairie birth and rebirth. Those were a few of the forces that whittled and fashioned those pocket-sized horned lizards and cleared the way for them, their prey, and a host of other small creatures and flora to exploit a decent, if somewhat perilous living. Those forces that shape the ecology of nature are called ecosystem services, and nature provides them free of charge. They continue until another force alters, diminishes, or obliterates them, resetting the board for a new ecosystem regime to take over, however depauperate it might be compared to its predecessor. We will venture forth to explore those disruptive superseding powers, but not yet. Our first task is to tease apart and understand those creative forces and the various size lanes that they carved into the grassland ecology for its various sized inhabitants to travel in. But our story begins long before there were horned lizards or bison or even grasslands. It begins when the area encompassing those current grasslands was a shallow inland sea. This was the Cretaceous period, which began about 144 million years ago. Fossils of tyrannosaurs, nodosaurs, triceratops, and other dinosaurs are buried in its mainland strata, while remains of giant fishes and mollusks give testament to the marine life that was present. Many of these creatures, along with the Cretaceous period itself, met the beginning of their end around 65 million years ago when a giant asteroid struck the Earth near what is present-day Yucatan Peninsula. This was effectively a blunt force shakeup of the planet's then dominant ecologies and climates. Dinosaurs and cycad-like seed plants called Bennettitalians that had inhabited the Earth for hundreds of millions of years before suddenly winked out, opening up available niches and resources for opportunistic up-and-coming lineages. Mammals, flowering plants, and their corresponding pollinators, including bees and moths, fell into their stride and proliferated, even flourished. But something else was happening underneath the surface when the great asteroid struck. The formation of the Rockies was what set in motion the creation of Texas horned lizard habitat. As tectonic plates are often wont to do, they were moving. The Pacific plate was being pushed eastward underneath North America's continental plate, thrusting it upwards, setting in motion the uplift of the emerging Rocky Mountains, and from the foot of the Rockies, tilting the continental plate eastwards at a slope of 10 feet per mile all the way to the Mississippi, causing that inland sea to drain away. And now, if we fast forward a bit to about 57 million years ago, where that inland sea was, we now have humid forests dominated by palm trees and inhabited by crocodilians. Primitive horses soon appear, like this Hippohippus, a descendant of some of these horses that you see here. And these horses had puny teeth, adequate for eating soft woodland leaves. There were primitive North American camels and rhinos in same habitats that had similar teeth anatomy as well. Then about 25 million years ago, the tooth anatomy of these species descendants began a marked change. All of them developed taller, higher crowned teeth, adapted for eating a popular newcomer, a tough, wiry, arid-adapted flowering plant called grass. So the Rocky Mountains had not been idle during this time interval of 57 to 25 million years ago, but had been continuing their gradual uplift. Keeping pace with their peak's unhurried but persistent increase in elevation was their ability to stop eastbound clouds carrying moisture from the Pacific. So precipitation therefore fell mostly on the windward side, on the western side of the mountains. East of the Rockies, extending to the Mississippi, this created a relatively drying effect called a rain shadow, which was not optimal for trees to grow, but rather was favorable for perennial grasses. So around this time, grass and seed-eating social insects like harvester ants and harvester termites, both important in horned lizard diet, began to migrate from Mexico and point southward onto the Texas plains about 20 million years ago. Grasses and wildflowers drew them there. The original central prairie was mostly treeless, except for species like cottonwoods and willows that grew along the streams. As most trees, however, retreated under the onslaught of strong and desiccating winds coming off the Rockies, the grasses yet advanced. Trees were threatened by prairie conditions. Grasses were threatened with a good time. When water is scarce over many generations, the plants that successfully persist are the ones born with smaller bodies requiring smaller amounts of water. Thus, grasses fit the bill. And this tendency of plants having smaller bodies as water gets scarcer holds true for grasses too. As precipitation is comparatively low in the western half of the Great Plains, the dominant grasses there are shorter than the dominant grasses in the rainier eastern half. The intervening zone between these two geographic extremes has a mashup of these short and tall grass species, plus a few of medium height. Hence the names of the three general ecoregions of the central grasslands from west to east: short grass, mixed grass, and tall grass prairies. They are general regions because there was no hard delineated boundary, be it geographic or species assemblages between them. Elements of each of them interlaces in and out of the other at any given time or place on the plains. They are broad categories designated not by which species are absent or present, but by which species are dominant. Texas horned lizards were historically found in all three types, though today they are mostly absent from tallgrass prairie, probably due in no small part to the fact that less than 1% of tallgrass prairie remains. It's the most endangered North American ecosystem. Recent research at TCU suggests that having herbaceous vegetation like bunch grasses and forbs around for shade prevents horned lizards from experiencing lethal temperatures on the ground during summer months in Texas. So horned lizards need weeds. Depending on location, all three types of prairie can even occur on the same hill. North-facing slopes have less evaporation than south-facing slopes, and so relatively taller, thirstier species of mixed grass can grow dominant on the north side of a hill, while short grasses dominate the hill's south side. Meanwhile, the tallest tallgrass species dominate the damp bottoms at the foot of the north slope. In wet years, fingers of tallgrass patches extend westward for hundreds of miles. In years of intense drought, those tallgrass species contract and retreat eastward and are replaced by the arid-adapted short grasses. This mishmash of prairie types in one place is probably very good for horned lizards. As you can see in this excellent map that painstakingly outlined the subregions within the three major prairie types, there's also a north-south cool-warm gradient with an equally fuzzy, ever-changing border as the east-west wet-dry gradient. The central grasslands historically spanned thousands of miles from subarctic climates in southern Alberta to subtropical climates in south central Texas, with growing seasons as short as 100 days in the north and as long as 250 days in the south. Grasses adapted to the northern climate are called cool season grasses, while warm season grasses dominate throughout the range of the Texas horned lizard, with 74% of Texas native grass species, and that's 347 of 469 total species, being warm season species, for instance. But it's more complicated than that. Cool season grasses advanced into the south and can dominate the cooler months in the spring and fall. And during warmer months, they give way to warm season species. And the inverse of that scenario happens in the north. Additionally, elevational gradients come into play. So essentially, which grass species dominate a particular place at a particular time depends on slope, soils, season, climate, precipitation, latitude, and altitude. All right, so trees need ample moisture, and a dry atmosphere deprives them of that. Strong winds topple them over, uproot them, splinter their trunks. Fires fell them. Freezing rain, blizzards, and lightning strikes cripple them by breaking their boughs. Browsers denude their bark, and grazers trample their seedlings and rub against saplings. In short, most of the conditions of the open prairie spell the death of trees, but render most plains grasses relatively unfazed, if not outright helping them. So unite the various engineers of grassland ecosystems: wind, water, soil, drought, roots, fire, and grazers. You might notice that there is considerable overlap between these engineers in terms of their individual roles as raw materials and as drivers of plains ecology. So when the Rockies were rising, the so-called Rocky Mountain front, the leeward side that comes down to meet the plains, gathered dry, strong winds out of the west. And this carried windborne silt down from the mountains and across the plains, depositing as much as 5 feet deep throughout much of the breadbasket of the continent. The bulk of this region's deep, rich soils, however, were brought there down from the Rockies by water, frequently in the form of ice. The movement of glaciers formed much of the soil, called glacial till, by grinding rock down into a flour-like consistency. Streams formed and ran downhill, also carrying their waters and sediments eastward. Prairie plants, fungi, and dirt dwellers like earthworms modified these sediments into fertile soil. And not all the soil is created equal. This is a USDA map showing soil colors across Texas, with samples from these regions in the composite image on the right from my master's thesis. These soil colors become a critical player and shaper of Texas horned lizard's survival, diversity, and physical makeup. The eastern edge of the prairie along the Mississippi Delta approaches sea level and regularly brings in moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. Traveling west from the Mississippi Delta to the other edge of the plains, every mile on average gets less humid and is windier and has more solar radiation and evaporation. This western edge of the prairie, tucked tight in rain shadow along the front of the foot of the Rockies, is a mile high and dry. As you leave the foot of the Rockies and go back east again, every mile on average gets lower, wetter, and warmer, and the soils get darker. They start out various shades of brown along the western edge of the prairie's high desert grasslands, like sample A in the composite image there from Alpine, Texas. And by the way, there were horned lizards in all of these pictures. They were just cropped out, and they tended to match the soils where they were found better than any other place. And anyway, from there, from the western edge out in the Trans-Pecos eastward, it gradually transitions to reddish brown or tan in the central prairie, like boxes B and D there. Those are from the Rolling Plains and Freer in South Texas plains, respectively. And they become dark gray or even black along the eastern edge of the plains. So horned lizards were actually in each, so I already mentioned that. Okay. So another necessary ecosystem engineer of the Great Plains, and a necessary one for habitat of horned lizards, is drought, at least occasionally. So warm, so-called Chinook winds from the western side of the Rockies that the Blackfoot people referred to as snow eater brought the first pastures at spring thaw. But there was an even more influential wind that shaped the ecology of the Great Plains. But this was not a wind that any of the creatures of the plains ever felt on their fur, feathers, or scales. The polar jet stream is that belt of wind that is responsible for the droughts. It circles the Earth about 4 to 6 miles above its surface in the northern temperate zone, and it's the barrier between cool, dry wind from the Arctic and warm, damp wind from the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see in this satellite image. The point of contact between them sometimes crystallizes into low-pressure systems and storms, the source of most of the precipitation of the western half of the plains, especially in springtime. When those storms happen, grasses do grow, as do the species that depend on them. More individuals are born and populations expand, but the belt's position is not fixed. Some years it sags far to the south, and those sagging years bring dry wind over every part of the plains north of the belt, and this means drought. At any random place on the plains, these droughts occur every 5 to 10 years. And when these droughts occur, grasses cut back production, more individuals die, and populations shrink. And this has been the way for millennia. If these droughts and arid conditions did not occur, the trees would come back, the grasses would disappear, and so would the grassland-dependent species of plants and animals. As a result, the types of grasses that survive the plains and its frequent droughts could not bank on being able to live for a single season and then die. Fewer than 5% of prairie plant species adopted this strategy. The majority had to be able to lie dormant during the bad, dry years. And so one solution, they could increase their longevity. Instead of being annuals, they could be more like perennials. And this meant that when conditions were hot and dry on the surface, they could send convoys of underground stems deep below. So prairie grass leaves are above ground are but a photosynthetic feather. You can pluck them out or wither them away, and eventually they will grow back. Their main corpus and shaft are securely anchored below ground. A mere 10% of their growth are what you see above ground, what we call the leaves and seeds and stems. A whopping 90% of their growth are below ground in the roots. Almost all of prairie grass's water and energy resources, including 75% of its carbon, are stored in its roots. This below ground energy storage is what enables prairie grasses to persist through years-long droughts. A tree stores much of this in its limbs and trunk. This is one of the reasons why you can kill a tree by severing its trunk at just above ground level, but similarly mowing grass at just above ground level results in fresh grass shoots. So as you can see from this classic textbook image, many prairie plants are bunch grasses. They don't invest much into spreading horizontally like turf grasses do with shallow roots like the example on the far left. And if fire or grazers remove the tops of bunch grasses, instead of leaving a trimmed down lawn, there's a lot of interstitial bare ground in between clumps, a feature that's very important for horned lizards and their prey. Some research has suggested that collectively 20 to 30% of the ground surface should be bare for Texas horned lizards. So if perennial grasses have a battle cry, it seems to be just stay put and wait it out. And it's the staying put part that keeps the plains ecology intact. Of the 469 native grass species in Texas, 85% of them, that's 397 species, are perennial. So what keeps the grasses alive and the prairie together is the profound depth of the prairie grass roots and the vice-like grip that they maintain on the plains' fertile soils. It's what keeps future dust bowls from happening in the future and the fertile soils from blowing to the wind. It's also what allows huge tracts of land to be burned to a crisp, but renewed and verdant within days or months at worst. So now we come to fire. So what's a really good way to keep some bare ground around and to open space up for wildflowers to bloom, providing food for those harvester ants? Fire. So afternoon thunderstorms in summer are an almost daily occurrence in many parts of the Great Plains. And as you can see from this map, lightning strike density per unit area and time increases as you travel east across the plains. Most of the storms are dry, but they're packed with lightning, and lightning ignites fires. Naturally occurring wildfires are beneficial for shaping and maintaining biodiverse prairie ecosystems. The Cheyenne and other Plains Indians described prairie fires as red buffalo, perhaps partly because the fires brought new growth of grasses and forbs, which in turn attracted bison as well as elk and pronghorn. So fires do a number of important things for prairies. And first, they keep the woodies at bay. And second, wildfires promote biodiversity of grassland ecosystems, and they do so in some interesting ways. For example, fires don't burn patches of vegetation in perfect, geometric plane shapes, but rather in meandering, winding, haphazard ribbons. And this creates a mosaic of burned and unburned habitat types in one place, allowing multiple species of plants and animals with different needs to establish. Plains Indians caught on to this and used fires to manage the land and its wildlife extensively. The zigzagging patches of bare ground allow cool season grasses and wildflowers that may normally only grow in early spring or fall to suddenly make an encore or surprise guest appearance. Zooming out, the result is a mosaic of grassland microhabitats, with stands of dominant communities suddenly interspersed with non-dominant communities, grasslands giving birth to altered grasslands in a parallel world. Third, fires release essential nutrients and minerals back into the food web that have become sequestered and locked up in plants since the last fire. There is an interesting story that highlights this principle and might even be relevant for Texas horned lizard habitat management. The red cockaded woodpecker prefers longleaf pine grasslands of the South. And these woodpeckers depend on frequent fire. Research at Florida State University shows that the more frequent the fire, the better the population response is of the woodpeckers. So why is this? The lead researcher's main hypothesis is very fascinating. These red cockaded woodpeckers mostly eat ants in the Apalachicola National Forest, actually a type of acrobat ant. And she thinks that calcium limitation could be a problem for the woodpeckers when fires become less frequent. Calcium is an element that came from massive dying stars long ago elsewhere in our galaxy and is a mineral necessary for life on Earth. Not getting enough calcium can be a problem for songbirds because a large clutch of eggs can have more calcium in the shells than in the entire mother bird's body. Calcium in the soil tends to get taken up by woody plants like shrubs that encroach upon fire-adapted grasslands when fires become infrequent. When this happens, the calcium content in the local insects and other arthropods drops, and it becomes a limiting factor throughout the food web. Burning the vegetation releases the calcium back to the soil. From there, calcium moves more freely throughout the food web once again, and insectivorous birds can get the calcium they need to live and reproduce from the insects they eat. There are ant-eating specialists like the red truncated woodpecker that are imperiled in part because they depend on this entire process. So what else eats acrobat ant? Has a tiny body, lays large clutches of calcium carbonate shelled eggs, and lives in fire-adapted grasslands? You guessed it. Texas horned lizards. So while most populations of Texas horned lizards are presumed to primarily depend on harvester ants for food, this study right here shows at least one population of them in central Oklahoma eats almost entirely acrobat ants, which I've highlighted in blue there in the abstract. So just like the woodpecker, and I know it's difficult to extrapolate from the processes that occur from one ranch to the next, let alone what happens in a population in one species to another species in another region. But I sometimes wonder if horned lizards could generally benefit from or even depend on fire in a similar manner the way these woodpeckers do. It's worth some study, I think. So grasses are pre-adapted to recovery from fire because their growing points are safely nestled beneath the soil surface. But those low growing points meant that grasses were pre-adapted for another type of leaf clipping engineer of grassland ecosystems, animals that we call grazers. Texas horned lizards have shared space with some very large animals for a very long time. I think many may find it hard to believe, but less than 150 years ago, there were still wild grizzly bears in Texas. In fact, that skull on the left resides at the Smithsonian currently, and the grizzly who owned it was shot in the Davis Mountains in Olympia Canyon in West Texas around 1899 or 1900. The newspapers vary on the date. But though they're now reduced in range to mostly parts of Yellowstone within the US and only number about 1,500, before European settlement, there were about 100,000 grizzlies that existed, and there were 50,000 in the lower 48. Most of them were on the Great Plains, along with a bevy of other large-bodied mammals. And these consisted of a dozen or so genera, including species such as black bear, gray wolf, bison, caribou, deer, elk, moose, and pronghorn antelope, all which ecologists tend to call native fauna today. Remarkably, in the geologic sense, none of them except for the antelope is truly native. The rest are Eurasian invaders, and the story of their survival to present day is joined at the hip with ours. The genus Homo, which includes modern humans and all its closest relatives, has its roots in Africa. Our conspecific kind, Homo sapiens, eventually followed grasslands out of Africa north to the Middle East, where wild humans would first become tamed by a wild annual grass that became what we know today as wheat, at least from the wheat's perspective. Another group of sapiens then radiated into the grasslands known today as the Asian steppes, where, aided with the technology of a spear, they hunted an array of Eurasian grazers and other large fauna for millennia. They followed those Eurasian herds across another grassland, the Bering Strait, into the North American continent and continued following them onto the Great Plains. Those Eurasian grazers co-adapted match for match to the arms race between themselves and the humans who hunted them. Whereas humans developed adaptations like spear tips and more sophisticated group hunts, the prey likely developed counter adaptations like more swiftness, secretiveness, fecundity, and wariness. Each group, hunter and hunted, had thousands of years, measured more aptly in generations wherewith to adapt. The dodo's song of oblivion was not to be theirs. But these dozen genera of large mammals were not the only ones horned lizards shared space with. Nor were they the largest, far from it. Texas horned lizards fossils have been found in Texas and Kansas in rocks dating back to the Pliocene, an epoch that occurred about 2.5 to 5.5 million years ago. This means that Texas horned lizards walked amongst giants like these Columbian mammoths for perhaps 1.5 million years. Mammoths like these, which are depicted in this mural at the Waco Mammoth National Monument, an hour south of here in Waco, Texas. In fact, this descent upon the North American prairie by both Clovis man and his co-immigrated Eurasian prey at the time was more the equivalent of an alien invasion than it was a colonial discovery. They were Johnnies come lately in a vast harbor of longtime plains residents, newbies amongst nobies. But some scientists have concluded there was one thing the nobies didn't know: the spear. At 11,500 years ago, in what amounts to a geological instant, more than 35 genera of North American large mammals, all weighing more than 100 pounds, most of them residents on the Great Plains that had thrived for millions of years, including during the Ice Age, suddenly disappeared. Climate and environmental upheaval, including from asteroid impact, may have also played an important, if not major, role in the demise of the Ice Age megafauna. The truth about man's role in causing these extinctions may never come to an overwhelming consensus, but at least one detail pertinent to our purpose is certain. Texas horned lizards have lived amongst and dodged the footsteps of some giant mammals for millions of years. It's perhaps impossible to imagine a sweeping vista of the early North American prairie without also conjuring breathtaking images of its wind-bent, waving grasses on open range being dined on by great herds of moving buffalo, the American bison. Musical composers have tried to evoke in song the reverence and sublime feelings often stirred by this very image. The John Dunbar theme in Dances with Wolves and the Ludlows and Legends of the Fall, written by Sir John Barry and James Horner, respectively, come to mind. This is one of the few notions regarding the pre-settlement history of the Great Plains where the romanticized view of that time and place, often portrayed in art form, approximates closely the reality. Bison, it is clear, one of the main ingredients of that early prairie. And bison as role players in the ecology of Texas horned lizards first came to my awareness while I was in grad school when our lab attended a lizard conference in southwestern New Mexico. And just to give a little back story on this, so every species has leftover behavioral and anatomical traits that worked prehistorically. But like a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox, they gain heritable blemishes and lose their purity and functionality over evolutionary time if they're severed from the natural selective force that push for those things to become part of their genome, right? Their nature. But so evolution in this sense is a use it or lose it business. Humans have their wisdom teeth and goosebumps, which likely aided them in prehistoric times, and it's possible that Texas horned lizards too have traits that aided them when large grazers like bison roamed the plains. This seems a likely prediction because bison alone have coexisted with horned lizards for some 200,000 to 800,000 years. But the reign of large grazers on the Great Plains was severed only very recently, between the 1880s and the 1920s. And so any traits that a prairie species may have evolved to cope with living amongst large hoofed animals would likely not have lost much of its original potency. One observation about horned lizard behavior possibly recalls their shared history with bison. When you're new at searching for horned lizards, it's a lot easier to see the ones that move. Most don't move, however, especially in towns, we've noticed. They depend on their camouflage to go unseen and hopefully pass by unnoticed. But of the ones that do move when in the vicinity, they tend to only move when you're close to stepping on them. They sprint in very short spurts of a few inches to a couple of feet and stop motionless again. This is fairly unique behavior for the nearly 100 species of lizards that come from the southwestern United States. Other lizard species there will often enough wait until approached at close range to flee shore, but they tend to be faster, run further, or otherwise perch atop a structure that lends itself easily to a hasty evasion. Structures like talus slides, boulder piles, or tall trees. But when a horned lizard moves, unless they've darted into a prickly pear patch or similar, they're still usually in capturing range. I've often wondered why the minimal movement when you're about to be stepped on. Perhaps there's an answer that makes sense in the light of evolutionary thinking. When we attended this Biology of the Lizards conference in 2018, to my knowledge, it was possibly the first scientific meeting in history dedicated solely to the biology of all lizards. And all the top minds of lizard science cognoscenti were there. One of them, who literally wrote the book on lizards and herpetology, Dr. Laurie Vitt, who wrote this book on the right here, raised his hand to pose a question when my advisor, Dr. Dean Williams from TCU, was giving his talk on the population genetics of Texas horned lizards. Do you think that the geographic distribution of Texas horned lizards can be explained by bison migration trails? He asked. The question stunned me because I immediately thought of the start and stop way that horned lizards move at the last minute when approached by a biped. Could this behavior be a recent leftover from the bison days? The geographic range of Texas horned lizards mirrors the epicenter for the historical geographic range of southern plains bison. Dr. Vitt's hypothesis made sense at first blush. Texas horned lizards need a mixed height mosaic of grassland habitat, sunny and open places with some bare ground between grass clumps for basking and foraging in the grazed areas, and dense and shaded places with taller grasses for cooling off and hiding in the ungrazed areas. And the tamped and trimmed trails of bison migration routes would bring a regular, made-to-order landscape suitable for the needs of horned lizards with well-rested vegetation between grazings. Other prairie herp species, like ornate box turtles, are also believed to have been dependent on bison for their existence. The meat and potatoes of their diet is dung beetles, and their geographic range shown here is nearly identical to Texas horned lizards and southern plains bison. Perhaps Dr. Vitt was right. Maybe not only could horned lizard distribution be partly explained by historic bison trails, but maybe the short-spurted stop-and-go shuffling behavior of horned lizards was a ghost of their recent but long past with bison. Invertebrates in bison dung fed a variety of birds, amphibians, and reptiles, and horned lizards do eat beetles. So I think the presence of the bison species on the Great Plains made possible the presence of many other species. And they helped horned lizards expand their range. There's another aspect of old bison trails that I believe has some relevance for those who want to restore horned lizards to the Texas landscape. Fingers of the central grasslands historically extended in broad meandering strips throughout the eastern half of the United States prior to the early 1800s. Lightning ignited fires and large migratory herbivores like mammoths, mastodons, and musk oxen, and later bison, elk, and deer, had foraged and sustained these byways of eastern grasslands millions of years before humans arrived, allowing corridors of tall grasses to snake their way through environs otherwise suited for swamp and forests. But after the arrival of humans, and especially in areas with relatively lower lightning flash density, such eastern grassy openings were maintained through the early 1800s, in large part due to regular indigenous set fires. Wandering from meadow to salt lick to waterhole, and sometimes carrying central grassland seeds in their dense fur, herds of bison migrated to and fro along these paths of least resistance, which are called buffalo traces. Such traces left trails described by early pioneers as being up to 3 wagons in width, further discouraging woody growth. So thus come together 2 major components, fire and large herbivores as accelerator and reinforcer, and a positive feedback loop of grassland maintenance. Fires set by natives held the trees at bay, accelerating grassland growth. And buffalo stamped out the straggling post-fire saplings and ate the new grass germinated by the fires, reinforcing the same. This allowed many prairie animal species like bison, elk, possibly the odd grizzly bear, and at least 2 plant species, running buffalo clover and short goldenrod, to wander hundreds of miles east of the Mississippi watershed. Now here's where this gets really interesting. Do you know what the first specimen was that Thomas Jefferson received from the Lewis and Clark expedition? It was a Texas horned lizard, and not just any Texas horned lizard, it was this Texas horned lizard that you see here. And where did they find it? It was almost immediately in the vicinity after taking off from St. Louis, Missouri in May of that year in 1804. St. Louis, so just think how far east Texas horned lizards ranged back in 1804. You have to drive over 5 hours due west from St. Louis without stopping to pee, eat, or get gas before you could find a Texas horned lizard nowadays. Why were they found that far east? Well, in terms of what we've been talking about, buffalo traces, I think that land management practices of Plains Indians combined with the reinforcement of game traces could have allowed Texas horned lizards to have such an expansive range. And look how far east these buffalo traces went. Most of them being natural thoroughfares through the American frontier were later paved into roads and highways like this US Highway 150 in Indiana. It's an intriguing and perhaps instructive thought for us who want to restore prairie species that the activities of humans in the past could have helped horned lizards and other prairie species expand their range and not shrink it. Bison naturalist Dale Lott put it this way: when Europeans came to North America, bison reached the Atlantic coast and the Carolinas and lived in every state east of the Mississippi, but Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. The openings in the woods where they grazed owed their existence to active management by Native Americans. These meadows were closely akin to the pastures European settlers would create for their cattle, except that the Indians used fires rather than axes. Through fire, they managed the habitat to favor the species they preferred to hunt, much as present-day managers might manipulate wetlands to favor ducks, stream temperatures to favor salmon, or rangeland plants to favor deer, close quote. Even trails whose formations are often attributed to more recent blazing than that of buffalo traces may ultimately have their true roots in pre-settlement times and causes. So why do I think Native American land management practices and game traces could have allowed Texas horned lizards to go so far east and have such a more of a range? Here's an example. So the Southern Butterfield Overland Stage Trail, for instance, in operation from 1858 until 1861, started in St. Louis and crossed through historic Texas horned lizard habitat in southeastern Missouri, northeastern Arkansas, southeastern Oklahoma, and into North Texas from there, turning westward. This famous stage line, featured in many Western films, including Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, that carried mail and passengers from St. Louis to San Francisco, was itself traced along a native trade route that Delaware Indian scout Black Beaver, depicted here, had guided Captain Randolph B. Marcy along in 1849 to establish and map a safe passage for 49ers seeking gold out west. Black Beaver knew the path and its surrounding region because he had trapped and traded beaver pelts along the Pecos and Rio Grande for the American Fur Company. Therefore, a stagecoach mail trail developed from Indian trade routes, and trade routes developed from hunting tracks that followed game traces. Although Texas horned lizards can no longer be found on the eastern stretches of the Butterfield Overland Trail between St. Louis and northeast Texas, a few smaller remnants and reminders of the open west, like collared lizards and roadrunners, can still be found far east in small outlying pockets of preserved glades and parts of the Ozarks to this day. Regular prescribed fires, it has been learned, are key in maintaining them. Nevertheless, continuous overgrazing by domestic cattle, indigenous fire suppression, the gradual conversion of buffalo traces to roads, and more hunting by natives and early white settlers with guns rendered the eastern half of the United States such that by 1830, barely more than 200 years after the Pilgrims landed, glades, game traces, and other grasslands north of the coastal plain were diminishing, and there were few bison or elk seen east of the Mississippi from then on. So this is a spot at the Fort Worth Nature Center, and every time I pass it, I always think the horned lizards would do well here. Because bison have such high food intake needs, they prefer to eat whatever grass happens to be the most dominant at any given time. But this allows opportunities for forbs and other grasses to temporarily take their place. So in natural systems and on open range, grazed areas tend to support higher species diversity than ungrazed areas. And these denuded areas open up a lot of different habitat for different animals like mountain plovers and bobwhite quail, and seed harvester ants can search the bare ground for seeds in these places. Horned lizards, of course, can look for the ants, and American kestrels and greater roadrunners can look through the defoliated ground for lizards and grasshoppers. And horned lizards and box turtles and hognose snakes can lay their eggs in the loose soil where the bison pass through. So in contrast, other areas of the prairie were left undisturbed by bison for years, adjacent to the places that they denuded, which allowed those uneaten bunch grasses to regrow their roots and grow tall. So here in that lush grass cover, greater prairie chickens took refuge, prairie voles and elk fed themselves, bobwhite quail nested in basketball-sized perennial bunch grass species like little bluestem. Texas horned lizards rested at the base of those bunch grasses during the hottest parts of the day, and accumulated grass stem litter offered kindling for regenerative wildfires. And as fires were more commonly started in these densely vegetated areas, newly regenerated forbs and tender young grass leaves attracted more bison again. So I think a diversity of grazers probably also allowed the southern Great Plains to sustain the ants and other insects that horned lizards need, because their various grazing needs and activities encouraged a diversity of plants, especially forbs, to grow. So they used to say a squirrel could start at the Atlantic Ocean and go from tree branch to tree branch and make it all the way to the Mississippi without ever touching the ground. When they got to the Great Plains, that's where the squirrel stops. And that's also where the prairie dog, a kind of ground squirrel, begins. A general rule in zoology is that the smaller a warm-blooded animal, like a mammal, is, the higher its surface area to volume ratio is, resulting in more of its body heat being lost to the surrounding environment. And to offset the loss, the higher its basal metabolism must be. Smaller bodied mammals in the plains do not need as much daily food as a 1-ton bison, but they need better food with higher protein and less fiber to maintain homeostasis. This means that other grassland herbivorous species, from 1,100-pound elk to 20-gram deer mice, will consume different parts of the prairie vegetation than bison do. Pronghorn, like bison, numbered in the tens of millions on the Great Plains pre-European settlement. Their long association with bison habitat is maybe evidenced in the curious observation that baby pronghorn resemble bison dung patties when curled up and nesting motionless on the ground, possibly fooling potential predators by mimicking something common and inedible. Pronghorn prefer to eat small, non-woody broadleaf plants, like forbs or wildflowers. And so due to the patchy distribution of their preferred forage, the male pronghorn are territorial against other males. And in a pasture that's 95% grass and 5% wildflowers, a pronghorn will graze on half grass and half wildflowers. But the grasses they do need are different than what bison need. Pronghorn eat young grass and the growing parts near the roots because these are better forage for their relatively higher metabolism. Both have more protein and less indigestible fiber, and for the same reason, they are both growing. Pronghorn's partitioning of prairie forage reinforces the growth of these wildflowers and helps maintain patches of short vegetation and bare ground, which are very important for the habitat mosaic needed by horned lizards and other species. Prairie dogs are another species that create horned lizard habitat, and they probably do it better than any other species because it's permanent habitat as long as the prairie dogs are present. At the edge of the prairie dog towns is idyllic habitat for horned lizards because they can shuffle between open clipped grass areas and herbaceous cover where it hasn't been clipped. Prairie dogs stand about a foot tall, so they keep the grasses trimmed under 12 inches around their town. And their excavations and communities support some 170 vertebrate species, and at least 4 plant species are strongly associated with prairie dog towns. Prairie dog numbers concentrated on the Great Plains a little over a century ago are roughly equivalent to the current number of humans on the entire planet, possibly more than 5 billion. Collectively, they originally occupied an area almost exactly the size of California, 155,000 square miles, or 20% of all the then available shortgrass and mixed grass prairies spread between southern Canada and northern Mexico. In fact, while photographing habitat for this book, a fellow researcher, Amber Long, and I visited this prairie dog town maintained by the Nature Conservancy in West Texas in Brewster County. When we pulled the Jeep Wrangler over to the side of the road and got out and walked to the barbed wire fence here to snap photos of the prairie dogs and their landscape, within seconds we noticed under the fence several Texas horned lizards scat like this. And we broke this one open so you can see the harvester ant pieces inside the red pieces there. Pronghorn were there too and dotted the horizon. A visit to a West Texas prairie dog town will often reveal several rare or imperiled species. And I think there's a lesson in there. Prairie dogs are themselves relatively rare, reduced to about 1% of their pre-settlement numbers. It makes sense that so many species that depend on their towns to also be rare. At this prairie dog town, this particular one, a summer's day drive through it can turn up Texas horned lizards, but also ornate box turtles crossing or basking on the road, as well as burrowing owls, butcher birds, ferruginous hawks, Swainson's hawks, prairie falcons, golden eagles, long-billed curlews, and pronghorn antelope flitting and walking about. A lot of this stuff I got just from looking at the area on iNaturalist. Road cruising at night through the same prairie dog town can allow visitors to encounter tiger salamanders and prairie rattlesnakes. In fact, 5 different species of rattlesnake can be seen on that roughly 20-mile stretch of road that traverses the prairie dog town. And that's more rattlesnake diversity than I know of in any other 20-mile stretch of road in Texas. And these habitats are probably the most reliable places where one can still observe a Mexican hognose snake, which is an endearing but dwindling plains and desert grassland species in Texas. Not to mention among the most dependable places to also see a horny toad in West Texas. It may well one day be written in history books that saving and restoring prairie dogs to much of their former range will save and restore many species, including Texas horned lizards. So Texas horned lizards also benefit from even smaller grazers. Grasshoppers, for instance, are perhaps the most important herbivores of the prairie in terms of their collective mass and how much grass they consume relative to other species, including bison. But grasshopper abundances are positively correlated with abundances of pocket gopher mounds in some regions of the plains, likely due to the amount of bare soil created on them. The bare ground serves as nesting and nursery sites for eggs and young nymphs of grasshoppers, which results in more grasshoppers. And just think on how many species of fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals eat grasshoppers. So pocket gophers are beginning to be considered a keystone species of the prairie in this way. More than 50 vertebrate species are strongly associated with pocket gopher mounds and tunnels. It's even possible that a species of perennial forb, the large beard tongue, depends on the combined presence of pocket gophers and fire, and especially the bare ground they create to survive. And at least 9 species of amphibians and reptiles are strongly associated with utilizing active Texas pocket gopher mounds in South Texas, including among them the Texas horned lizard. Wolves are another ecosystem engineer whose historic presence on the plains probably had a strong positive influence on the populations of horned lizards, because wolves are the mortal enemy of one of the main mortal enemies of Texas horned lizards, coyotes. As many as 750,000 to 1.5 million of the prairie subspecies, the Great Plains wolf, inhabited the plains from southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan southward into Texas. They, along with grizzly bears and mountain lions, were common enough throughout the Great Plains, but gray wolves are the most common of the plains' large predators, and in some ways the most important. Wolves are opportunistic, and they will eat any morsel of meat they happen upon, from mouse to moose, as one researcher put it. But even though they are adequate generalists, wolves still claim an area of specialization. They are adapted bodily and behaviorally to kill hoofed animals. In regions where wolves do have access to herds of large hoofed animals like bison, elk, caribou, wolf packs tend to be larger, comprising up to about 15 members, and will tend to hunt them in winter when snow and cold weather slows them down. In summer, wolf packs usually disband temporarily, and individual wolves will travel 20 or more miles per day seeking out smaller prey like white-tailed deer, raccoons, squirrels, coyotes, and opossums. All of these latter species, by the way, were likely fewer in number in historic prairie regions when wolves were common throughout the Great Plains. And this fact likely bears some instruction for Texas horned lizard conservation. Raccoons, opossums, and coyotes are small-sized predators, sometimes called mesopredators or mesocarnivores. All of them are scavengers known to eat Texas horned lizards. And Texas horned lizards have experienced enough predation pressure from some of them throughout evolutionary history that they even have accrued special adaptations against coyotes, for instance. The blood squirting behavior that you know about with Texas horned lizards, squirting blood from their eyes, is an adaptation against wild canids like coyotes. When large apex predators like wolves are present, they keep populations of these mesopredators and other prey in ecological balance through top-down control, and so are key in maintaining prairie ecosystem functions, allowing for Texas horned lizards to exist. So maintaining ecological balance through the food web via top-down controls and ecosystem service called a trophic cascade. And this service is only provided by large predators like wolves. It's possible that part of the reason we've seen this fallout in horned lizard numbers over the last few decades is that it's one example of the imbalance that happens when you have end-stage reverberations of a trophic cascade due to an absence of wolves. Nature relentlessly spent millions of years painstakingly designing wolves for this function. So no matter how technologically advanced humans become in the future, it's not likely we'll ever design a machine to do a better job or for cheaper. All right, so what happened to the horny toad? Well, a lot happened, and I think you need to go back far enough through the ways in which the Great Plains was dismantled starting in the early 1800s before you can come to something that resembles a satisfactory answer. One of the first things was the great plow-up of the plains. The first moldboard plows invented by Thomas Jefferson were made of either wood or cast iron, but the strong perennial grass roots broke those plows. It wasn't until John Deere invented the steel plow in 1837 that plows turned this thing on its head and broke the roots. It sounded like pistol shot when it happened, and it was a veritable Pavlovian dinner bell for other would-be farmers to come and settle the plains. And the perennial grasses, which invested mostly in their roots, the settlers didn't see much use for, and so they were replaced with annual grasses that invested more in their seeds. Annual grasses like corn and wheat, for instance. And this process continued. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States became a grain exporting country, feeding Europe during World War I. In just 5 short years from 1914 and 1919, an area of native prairie the size of Maryland and New Jersey put together, 13.5 million acres, was converted to wheat acreage in the southern Great Plains from Nebraska to Texas. What would this have meant for the horned lizards previously there? Undoubtedly, for most, a fairly quick annihilation, except perhaps for lizards in the farm margins, turn rows, alleys, and empty sandlots in nearby towns where tiny stands of remaining native grasses and wildflowers could sustain a few scattered and disjunct harvester ant colonies and other native insects, in turn sustaining a few scattered and disjunct populations of horned lizards for a while. And in conjunction with the great plow-up, we also killed off the animals of the American Serengeti. Animals that settlers saw as competitors for what they wanted to use the land for. So in a nutshell, here's what happened to those animals that helped make the prairie. And in the span, as you can see here, of one human's lifetime, most of them were either extirpated or driven near extinction. So we have bison. There were 27 to 30 million bison in North America around the year 1800. By 1884, there were less than 1,000. There were 15 million pronghorn antelope in 1820, and 80 years later, there were only about 13,000 in 1900. Prairie dogs went from 5 billion before European settlement to about 1 billion by 1900. Elk from 10 million to 100,000. Wild horses, about 2.5 million to only a few thousand left in the northern plains by the 1920s, and 0 left in the southern plains. Prairie wolves, or the Great Plains wolf that I mentioned earlier, went from 750,000 to 1.5 million, and they were declared extinct by 1926. And then grizzlies went from 100,000 in 1800 to just a few hundred, with none in the Great Plains by 1900. Beavers, there were perhaps several hundred million of those, and by 1900 there were only 100,000. And then for deer and coyotes, I have asterisks by them because they actually have since expanded to be more numerous than their pre-European settlement numbers. Deer, and by deer here I mean white-tailed deer. There were 15 million before European American settlement. By 1900, relaxed laws as far as hunting had reduced their numbers to about less than 100,000. But now we have over about, I think, 34 million deer, which is more than twice the number pre-European settlement. Coyotes were only found in the American West and in the Great Plains, but they've since expanded. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. All right, so when it comes to Texas horned lizards, here's what I think is interesting from that last table. So the U.S. government created an office for killing native plain species, especially predators and small grazers. The Bureau of Biological Survey issued this flyer in 1907, including directions for the destruction of wolves and coyotes, how to kill wolves and coyotes. And they generated federally funded propaganda to meet this end, such as this article in the Rocky Mountain News from 1922. It was very like anti-predator, the tenor of all this. But what happened was, as we killed off wolves, coyotes expanded their range from just the plains in the western U.S. To eventually enter their 49th state, Delaware, recently in 2010. The only state they haven't yet entered is Hawaii. So where wolves are, you don't have many coyotes in general. And in those areas, coyotes slink closer to towns and use humans as cover. Wolves don't want to go near humans, but coyotes do. And to coyotes, humans are more benign than wolves. Wolves actively seek out coyotes in their dens and kill them. And when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone in 1995, within the first 2 years, park naturalists found over 100 dead coyotes at elk carcasses that the wolves had killed. So just to illustrate the relationship between wolves and coyotes. All right, so and in the 1890s, the United States had just experienced its first major years-long drought in the Great Plains. This isn't something that happens naturally every decade or three. And in answer to this, in 1898, the U.S. Department of Agriculture established the Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction under the auspices of the newly founded Bureau of Plant Industry. Implied in the very name of the office, set apart, I don't think they went about this in a very conservation-minded or scientific way. Many ecological disasters occurred from this effort, whether it be the crown vetch, initially envisioned as a soil stabilizer, but escaping the intended roadways, to crested wheatgrass used as a forage because it increases under high-intensity grazing, but overtaking the farmland after the bust of the Dust Bowl, or Chinese chestnuts carrying with them the blight that rendered the American chestnut extinct. All of these trace their ill-favored roots to this office, and in particular to one individual, Frank Mayer, who was later on labeled as the Typhoid Mary of plant introductions in the U.S. Okay, another deep cut to the native prairies was that we got rid of the native grazers on open range and deferred grazing regimes, and replaced them with fenced pastures and domestic livestock, which allowed many, if not most, of the prairie plants to be overgrazed and without rest periods. So this is a map of South Texas, of some counties down there. Anyways, it's showing Texas cattle brands, the number of cattle brands registered in these counties in the year 1865. And in some of these counties down near San Antonio, there are hundreds of cattle brands registered by this time, which implies a lot of barbed wire fences. And there were other things that happened after this. You know, we had railroads and introduced fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides in the first half of the 1900s. Many of these were used as chemical warfare in the First and Second World Wars, but then rebranded and sold as pesticides to farmers in the Great Plains. And we can't talk about horned lizards without talking about red imported fire ants. This is from a book and a website called the Texas Landscape Project. I highly recommend it if you want to understand the history of the Great Plains in Texas. And I've taken a lot of information from this that's helped me put together the history. But the red imported fire ant was introduced into the U.S. through ship ballast, likely into the port of Mobile, Alabama in the 1930s. And in about 20 years' time, they had spread all the way to Texas, as you can see here on this map. And red imported fire ants have been implicated in the population declines in several grassland species like harvester ants, quail, horned lizards, box turtles, and hognose snakes. This is often cited as one of the final blows to horned lizards in the eastern half of the state. All right, so what can we do? This part deserves its own PowerPoint, really, because there's so much we can do, but I think one of the first things is remembering that horned lizards are insectivores, which means not using pesticides in the yard or on the ranch, and creating habitat for native insects. I mentioned this book briefly in the first slide. The author has worked with the National Wildlife Federation to develop a native plant finder for people. You can simply put in your zip code and it suggests native plants for your region ranked by how many species of moths and songbirds those plants support. And I think it could be a good place to start. Also, homeowners can learn about creating pocket prairies and wildscaping their yards for horned lizards, especially in parts of Texas that still have horned lizards. A good teaching example is the walled outdoor garden at the Chiricahua Desert Museum in southern New Mexico. They've landscaped it with native plants and other features I'm going to show you from some yards in Texas. And in this area, I highly recommend you visit it. It's run by herpetologists, owned by herpetologists, and there are 2 species of horned lizards that live on the outside of the grounds, and the horned lizards actually breed inside the stucco walled gardens that you can walk through, and hatchling horned lizards actually are born there every year. Okay, so this is a yard where horned lizards exist and breed in West Texas. This is in Alpine, Texas, that Amber Long and I visited summer 2020, and it's a beautiful lawn. It's very well maintained. It doesn't have any turf grass, which is something that horned lizards can't put up with. They can't traverse a turf lawn. But one of the things that I've noticed in some of the towns where you still have Texas horned lizards in some of the yards and in the alleyways and such is that a lot of these yards or a lot of these areas have dirt mounds. And this is the same, this is just on the outside of the fence of the previous house that I showed you. But Amber and I saw horned lizards that were built nests or tunnels into this dirt mound here where females had been laying their eggs. And I'm sure having the prickly pear there didn't hurt either. Of course, it does not hurt to have harvester ants around. This is actually at the Dixon Water Foundation MIMS unit in Marfa. It was probably about 2 or 3 feet across, just so I wanted people to see this so they would be able to recognize harvester ants. This is a yard, a couple of yards actually, separated by a driveway in South Texas. That one that has horned lizards in the yard on the left, because it's mostly just grown with wild forbs and a few grass species, and it's mowed, but there's bare ground in between the clumps, and we often have seen horned lizards in that yard. But in the yard next to it, where you have turf grass, I've walked past there quite a few times that I haven't seen any horned lizards or horned lizard scat, which is usually the giveaway of their presence. So they do need some bare ground. All right, and for ranch and range management for Texas horned lizards, what can we do about that? And there's quite a few things, but I've listed about 5. So first, remembering the history of the Southern Great Plains can be a good benchmark to mimic or even adopt, right? And second, I think we need to support deferred grazing regimes with long rest periods in between grazings, and or use prescribed fire management. Third, we need to support the conservation and restoration of species that build horned lizard habitat, like prairie dogs and wolves. And we can manage our lands for economically important species that have similar needs to horned lizards, like quail. So the people often bring up that, you know, horned lizards and quail have similar habitat needs, and I think the connection there is that quails look for a lot of the same kinds of seeds to eat that harvester ants look for. And quails nest in the bunch grasses, horned lizards hide underneath them during the hot parts of the day. So they tend to like the same kind of habitat. And we can help landowners develop wildlife management plans. Landowners in Texas can save on their property taxes if they meet the criteria for the state and for the county appraisal district to have a wildlife management plan. This is something I'm starting to learn how to do. So I started my talk with this slide. This was painted by Audubon in 1837 when he visited Galveston, Texas, my home county, and a place in Texas that no longer has horned lizards. I'm sure many of you have similar stories where you grew up. My hope is that we can do a lot of things like Plains Indians did 200 years ago to expand their range back to places Texas horned lizards used to be. I think we can. And with that, I thank you. And that's all.